is this book?
What is it?
The main thing I got from it was like this sense of feeling seen and validated.
Well, why does it have to be this way?
This book was placed in my hand for this moment.
Insightful, learned a lot, wrote some quotes that I'm ready to like paint on my wall.
I love this book!
That we just kind of pull out some of the big themes that we see and talk about a few different ones.
I apologize if most of my contribution has K-pop references.
Alternative book title, The Feminine Mystique Part 2. You were really just gay all along. Welcome to Book Club.
With Julia!
And Victoria.
Those city girls that accidentally rode the bus to the end of the line because they were too engrossed in their book and then had to turn around and go back the other way. True story.
But we'd like to be your book friends. This is a podcast for the books we just can't shut up about.
And this week we're reading When We Were Birds by Ayanna Lloyd Banwo, an atmospheric novel set in Port Angeles, Trinidad, about love, death, and undoing colonial patriarchy. You know, small topics.
And if you're like, Port Angeles, is that a city? I don't understand. It is a fictionalized version of Port of Spain. I also had a long rabbit hole of like, where is this city? I want to see it. And like, nope, it's a fictional city, but based off a real place. This episode's going to contain a lot of spoilers, but whether or not you read the book, we're very glad you're here. Welcome to the party.
Yeah, welcome. If you'd like to support the show, you can rate, review, and subscribe on any and all podcast platforms. You can follow the book links in the show notes to shop on our bookshop.org affiliate page. We get a very small kickback, support indie bookstores, all that good stuff. You can join the book club at buymeacoffee.com/bookclubwithjv for lots of fun extra content and to help us save up for a transcription service to make our episodes more accessible.
Okay, about our author. Ayanna Lloyd Banwo is a writer from Trinidad and Tobago and currently resides in London with her husband. She grew up as an avid reader and studied English in undergrad at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. And she spent many years of her career in writing adjacent jobs. So she was teaching high school English, she was working in corporate communications and advertising. Honestly, she sounds like Julia and I. And I'm skimming over a long period of Banwo's life that was very involved with the literary scene in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. As an only child, Lloyd Banwo lost her mother, father, and maternal grandmother, she said, in quick succession over the course of 3 years. Oof. So 2013, 2014, 2015.
Oh my God.
Like a very difficult family death. So in 2018, at the age of 37, Lloyd Banwo moved to the UK to attend University of East Anglia for her master's in creative writing and eventually a PhD. And in an interview with, I think it was called Loop, she talked about this experience, saying, "I've promised my dead 3 books. It is a pact that I've made with people who are not here anymore. I was given 3 stories when my mother died, and I came here to the UK with a sense of these 3 books and what I wanted to accomplish." Wow. So When We Were Birds, our novel we're talking about today, is her debut novel. It's the first of the 3 novels that she says she has promised her dead. Not in the form of a trilogy, but just like there's 3 novels that she knows she wants to write. When We Were Birds was first published in February 2022 and got lots of awards. OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, Authors Club Best First Novel Award, shortlisted for a bunch of prizes, and longlisted for some as well. Lots of people liked it, and I can see why. The next novel that she's working on is slated to be released in 2025.
Cool. So first, a quick summary. As we'll get into, this book is a lot of vibes.
So many vibes.
And less plot clarity, we'll say. There's a lot of spiritual elements that you just gotta go with. So bear that in mind as I'm explaining the plot. The story takes place from the alternating perspective of 2 characters in, as we've said, the fictionalized city of Port Angeles, Trinidad. There's Yejide, who is the daughter in a matrilineal family structure, who is, we don't know this at the beginning, but she's about to inherit certain spiritual powers of like communing with and caring for the spirits of the dead. No big deal. And then the other character we follow is Darwin, also named Emmanuel. He was raised Rastafarian, is the only son of a poor single mother out in the countryside. And so he has to turn away from some of his beliefs because the only work he can find is as a gravedigger in the largest cemetery in Port Angeles. So he has to move to the big city, he has to shave his head, dead, because part of their religion is that you don't interact with or deal with anything to do with death. So he shaves his head, and it causes some tension with his mother. So he moves to the big city, and he soon learns that he is being asked to help cover up murders, basically, and take care of bodies for, like, corrupt government officials or, like, gangsters, unclear, organized through his boss. And his boss doesn't necessarily trust him to keep quiet. He's sort of being tested on whether he's willing to participate in criminal activity, and so this puts him in danger. So that's his main conflict. And then Yejide's mother, Petronella, dies. And so Yejide has to sort of carry out the death rituals of sending her mother's spirit to watch over the dead with their foremothers. And she also has to she's getting new powers for the first time and new ways of seeing the world and talking to the dead. And so she has to kind of learn to take that on and help the dead find some resolution and peace. And part of the process of taking on those powers, this doesn't happen until halfway through the book, is that a very powerful spiritual connection is formed between her and Darwin, where they like see each other in kind of a waking dream situation before they've even met in person. And then Yejide goes to the cemetery where Darwin works to plan how to bury her mother. And so when they do meet, they have this instantly powerful connection that draws them to each other, and they very quickly become lovers, even though they know they're like, this is crazy, I met you 4 days ago. We learned that their connection is something that's kind of baked into the matrilineal spiritual inheritance. It's not fully explained, but Yejide kind of helps Darwin interact with the spirit of his dead father. The story concludes with Darwin sort of standing up to his corrupt boss. There's some stabbing involved, and Yejide has to sort of fully accept and step into her powers in order to help him. Basically, she sort of calls all the dead who have been harmed by Darwin's boss to sort of deal with him and appease the dead and save Darwin's life. And it all comes to a head in this big kind of climactic moment. And in the resolution, they sort of end up living together in Yejide's family home. And Darwin makes a grave for his father and writes a letter to his mother, sort of hopefully beginning to mend their rift. And they sort of have a vision for their future in their new roles.
So, Julia, you were the one that picked up this book first and wanted to read it for the show. So, yeah. What was your experience with the book?
I had never heard of it before. I found this browsing a bookstore in New York. I had a huge stack, and I texted Victoria pictures of all of them. It was like, which ones should I buy? And part of the motivation for picking this one is that I had never read any Caribbean fiction, only some sort of theory that came from some Caribbean authors, which we'll get into later. And I really enjoy magical realism adjacent stuff. It seemed like, it wasn't too long. It just seemed like a nice space to inhabit for a while that was different from what I'd been reading recently. And so I read it over like the course of a week after I turned in my thesis. Woo-hoo!
Woohoo!
And it's one of those books that really requires you take your time. And there was actually a day I had a headache and I listened to a couple chapters of it being read. And they had two different readers, one for Yejide, one for Darwin, and they both had slightly different accents. So you could like hear the cadence of the dialect, which was really cool. That kind of helped immerse me a little bit. Part of what intrigued me about the book too is I'd never seen any specifically literature from Trinidad and Tobago. And I had a dance teacher growing up from there. And so I was pretty familiar with the dialect, but I couldn't articulate the rules of it to anyone. But it felt familiar enough. It felt like a familiar place to start reading Caribbean literature, I guess. Anyway, all that to say, I really loved it. I really like vibey books. It's the best way to describe it. Because when we were planning the episode, I was trying to figure out with Victoria, like, why? Because this book is very slow paced.
Yeah.
And so we were trying to figure out, like, okay, why did I love this one, but I couldn't finish something like Pachinko, and why I get so stuck on books like that. And I think it comes down to like the reason why it's slow paced, and is why I have a hard time with historical fiction a lot of times. Books that are slow because you get every single action that happens and all the artifacts of the book, and you're getting from point A to point B, so you get every single plot point, are very hard for me. Whereas this book is slow because it's all metaphors and characters just sitting in your feelings, and you never, you touch down to physical reality in certain moments, but that's not, it's about place and it's about character rather than plot. And you are getting plot things, but you don't know you're getting plot things until all of a sudden it's like the climax of the book and you're like, oh wow, all these things were coming together to make plot. I didn't know. I really like inhabiting cool spaces with cool characters, and I don't particularly care if I understand what's happening. It's a weird thing about me. Honestly, sometimes I prefer it to having really intricate plots. No thinking, just vibes is sometimes what I want from a story. And I had a grand old time. But I can understand if it's not everyone's cup of tea, because not a lot is happening for the first half of the book, you know? And I can understand that if you're more of a plot-driven reader. So yeah, but what about you? Because you took a lot longer to finish it than me, actually.
This book definitely took a little bit for me to get into. It doesn't help that I was also reading several books at the same time, so it didn't help me like focus in and kind of like just exist in this world and in this writing, like vibey writing style of the author. And I realized pretty quickly, I think I had this assumption because I looked at the length of the novel. I looked at the kind of how it was positioned. It's, magical realism elements in a love story. It's spellbinding is one of the descriptors on it. Like, I guess I had this idea that it would be more of a breezy read. Like, it wasn't a book I could just, like, breeze in and out of. Like, I'm often someone who reads on the train where I can, like, just throw my bookmark in mid-sentence, jump off the train, and, like, just go about my day. But then I would open the book again and be like, wait, what was happening? What were we doing? What was I feeling? And it's not a book I can read, like, while commuting or, like, hopping around the city. So once I was able to just kind of sit with the book, I had a few, like, longer reads where, like, I really needed to reach the end of chapters to pause and set the book down so that I could come back to it without feeling like, wait, what's going on? Especially, I read like the first maybe 5 chapters and then set the book down for like a week. But at that point, you haven't gotten Yejide in present time.
Right.
And so then I was like, wait a second. There was a story at the beginning. What was that story? So I had to reread the like mythology prologue section. And then I was like, what was happening with this guy Darwin? He's at a cemetery. Cool. Okay, I think I understand what's happening. Like, it kept having to be a refresher when I sat down with it if I had let it sit for too long. But once I was like really just honed in and just reading this book, I was like very there for it. And I really enjoyed it. I feel like a book of vibes, you also need like the right vibe to be sitting and reading it.
Yes.
So we had really beautiful weekends. So I sat by the lake and read for a long time. I sat in my apartment when I was tired and just like sat on the couch and just like cozied up and really got to live in the book, which is such a delightful reading experience. And so it's almost a bit magical to me when a book forces you to have the kind of like optimal reading experience, which is to really sit there and be with it. And so I understand why if others were able to get into it, because it does take a long time until like the action picks up and you're finally putting the pieces together of what's happening.
Yeah.
For a minute, I was like, oh, shoot, did we pick the wrong book? It's a pretty risky move for neither of us to have read it and said, let's talk about it on a podcast where we talk about books we can't shut up about when neither of us have finished it in order to be able to say if it was a can't stop talking about it kind of book. But I am definitely now like, I have so many thoughts. I'm so excited to talk about it.
Yay. So let's get right into it. Aside from being like a brilliant and moving story, this book is also like an important piece of Caribbean literature. And there's certain choices that the author makes that are very counter to kind of common...
You could say like common like UK, US publishing practices.
Yeah.
Which are like, the powerhouses of the English language publishing world.
Yes. Yeah, English language publishing very much controlled by these like big publishing conglomerates in the US and UK, really New York and London, kind of publishing, storytelling practices. So we wanted to look at this book through a post-colonial lens, which we're going to explain in half a second, to kind of see what Banwo has to say about death, colonialism, and patriarchy. Just some, light topics.
Real quick. So often on our show, for those who listen to a lot of episodes, we will interject some little bits of literary theory because Julie and I are nerds about this stuff.
Yeah.
Hopefully this gives you just a different pair of goggles to wear for a moment while we talk about this book. Maybe kind of ground where our reading perspective is informed by. But if you're like, I really don't care about theory, just hang tight. Maybe you'll get some fun nuggets, and then we'll get into more just details about the book itself. So you don't need to know any theory to get into this next part.
Yeah.
But this is just a moment to play around with like different ways of reading and different ways to think about the stories that we consume in our culture.
Yeah, it helps us acknowledge that, like, the way that we read stories as individuals and as cultures from certain life experiences, certain expectations, certain practices, and certain histories, right? That we kind of are swimming in. And so it can be nice to take a step back for a second and acknowledge that that's how we see and experience the world and say, okay, well, what if we looked at it a different way? What new things could we find? It's kind of like, I'm trying to think of where you would experience this, but like, I feel like growing up, there were kind of activity books where you would have like a little, it was like a magnifying glass with a piece of plastic that was like red filtered or blue filtered. And if you put it over the paper with like red or blue dots, like new pictures would appear.
Yeah.
If you don't know what I'm talking about, this probably sounds very silly. It's like the stuff they use in like 3D goggles. You know, you have like one blue lens and one red lens.
It makes different things pop out, you know, that it were there the whole time, but maybe you see it differently because you've got a different lens on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to do the post-colonial theory introduction because I have been living and breathing this stuff.
I was so excited when you were like, I'll take that section. I was like, thank goodness. It's been a real long, hot minute since I have read or studied any of this stuff. So I'm here to learn. Teacher Julia is here.
Yeah, anthropologist Julia is, I'm going to put on my anthropology hat for a minute, because studying anthropology at a Belgian university means we're always applying a post-colonial lens to everything, because I'm studying amongst the colonizers, you know? So, so anyway, here we go. This is post-colonial theory. It's a critical academic study of culture, politics, economics, basically all of the practical and cultural legacies of mostly European colonialism. I think you can apply a post-colonial look to Japanese colonialism, but it's often a bit different. So it's mainly European colonialism, focusing on kind of the impact of what colonialism left behind. It started to emerge in the 1960s as scholars from previously colonized countries began publishing texts about how it had impacted their people as individuals, political structures, as countries, whatever, and kind of developing a critical theory form of analysis. So it's a way of analyzing all sorts of fields. It doesn't have to be anthropology or literature, but you can apply it to pretty much anything. So the main sort of periods of decolonization, so the removal of colonial powers, there's sort of two main periods that get written about the most, and they really impact this book. So one of them is the British disengagement from its second empire. So this is a lot of India and the Caribbean, and then the decolonization movements in the 60s and 70s in mostly Africa, but lots of other places. And I want to point out, 60s and 70s, this is incredibly recent, the history and theory that we're talking about. The last African country to gain independence happened in the 80s. Apartheid South Africa ended in 1995, the year we were born. And Barbados, you guys probably remember when Rihanna was in the news in 2020? That was because Barbados was leaving the British Commonwealth literally 3 years ago. And the US still has colonies that don't have any constitutional power. All that to say, we're dealing with incredibly recent history that people who are not very old are experiencing and processing the aftermath. And this movement came out of actually a lot of the French Caribbean. So Trinidad and Tobago is British, I believe, like Jamaica and Barbados.
Yeah, they received independence from British colonial rule in 1962.
So Trinidad and Tobago was colonized by the British, but the French Caribbean, one of the sort of early figures of post-colonial theory is Frantz Fanon, or just Fanon, if you're don't want to use the French accent. He's originally from Martinique, but he got a degree in Paris, and then he spent most of his adult life in French Algeria, helping them with their independence movement. He was a psychologist, and so he wrote about the psychological toll that colonialism took on its subjects based on his professional experience, his experience working with the revolution, and his own personal experience as a colonial subject. And one crucial way post-colonial theorists have sort of practically applied the ideas of decolonization is through language. So actually I didn't take a class with him, but one of the professors in my undergrad university actually is like a huge figure in post-colonial theory. He's a scholar from Kenya named Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and his whole thing was that they should stop writing literature and scholarship and plays and everything in the colonial languages and start using their own again. Give importance to their own native tongues. You know, there's a lot of discussion about, like, as a result of the lingering effects of colonialism, many people speak a new third language. It's not the original colonizer English or colonizer Spanish or French, but it's also not necessarily the language that they were speaking pre-colonization. It's a new third thing. When We Were Birds, this text that we're talking about, was written in Trinidadian English. So it's a different dialect of English from like academic English or standard American English or Queen's English, which we most often see books written in. But those are all just dialects of English. We should point out, there is also a Trinidadian Creole, and a Creole is like a true hybrid language where it's like two languages had a baby and it's a totally new language. That's very different than Trinidadian English, which is a dialect of English. So they're two different things.
Yeah, so making this choice to write in Trinidadian English was obviously very important to the author. And Banwo spoke in an interview kind of highlighting not only some of these reasons, but like what this process was like. She said, "None of us are free from our colonial education system. At school, I was taught to speak in standard English and to write like I was Jane Austen, but your vernacular is very different, so you're always moving between your different Englishes and voices. I knew from the start that this was not a novel in, quote, standard English, but for a while, I was mediating the narrative voice more than I needed to. It was uncomfortable." Later she says, "The moment that it changed was in a workshop at University of East Anglia with Giles Foden. He was sitting and listening to me and he said, 'Who are you worrying about? Who are you worrying for? You're doing two things. Just go with the one that's you. Just go for it.' And I let go of the colonial English teacher in my head. And once I committed, it was so easy. That was the language the book needed to be in."
I like that.
So even for Banwo, it was not like, it's a thing to mediate, you know, to kind of figure out exactly where your voice is in a novel as a writer. But also as she's mediating kind of these many Englishes that she speaks, that she writes in, that she reads in, and finding not only her voice as a writer, but the voice of her characters and the voice of her narrator and making it feel cohesive. And I think I'm kind of zooming out a bit in our conversation of like what a post-colonial lens does. It's kind of acknowledging, being aware of, dissecting, analyzing the effects of colonialism, like in this process of decolonization. And for Anya Lloyd Banwo, it was also, how do I write about my home in a way that's true and also pushes back against these colonial lenses that others may have, knowing that this novel is being published at first in the UK and then a month later in the US and Canada, reaching out to these international audiences, and how can she use this text to push back against these different colonial lenses. So in the same interview with Will Forrester in Penn Transmissions, she says, "You know, there are two imposed projections of islands. The idyllic island, the tourist brochure, a beach with a hotel front, a couple of people thrown in for, quote, local color. And then there's the mysterious island, the colonial Gothic projection with its people that do, quote, strange things who are scary but tantalizing. And both are false. Both are islands seen through different colonial lenses. Islands have cities which have the same needs and energies as cities anywhere else. And so Port Angeles and the Trinidad of the novel aren't just different to the physical point of Spain and Trinidad. Those differences aren't just what the book needed. They also are very real in a way that might seem strange to some readers who do not know them. They're extremely urban, extremely cosmopolitan, with high-rises, yachts, wealth, people going for brunch, but they are also indigenous, rural, with hidden places that you only know if you know. So as much as Port Angeles is mythical and magical, that's very much how cities are.
Yeah.
Which kind of gets us into something I know you and I wanted to talk about a bit when it comes to what is this book, you know, like genre-wise, like how do we describe it? I loved your word atmospheric at the top of the episode to try to encapsulate the feel of this book. I think this also calls to question these, I know it's such a annoying word, but you used it first, hegemonic. These very like London, New York publishing house categories of how do we sell this? How do we market this? Like they're very helpful in describing what a book is. Like for you to know this has some magical realism elements helps you pick it up off the shelf. But like how is the author going to talk about it? And I think that last quote from Banwo also kind of highlights the like there is the mystical and the magical and the very urban, and it's a city where people have brunch and get coffee. And it's like, it holds all those things as a city. And in the same way that her writing also holds all these things. It's realistic and it's magical, but that doesn't make it like set apart as this very separate thing that's like ununderstandable.
Yeah, because we were trying to figure out whether we should even call it magical realism, because there's a lot of spirituality in the book, which we don't have time to fully get into. And it made me think about how, like, magical realism is a very, like, Northern European cultural genre, because in the sort of view of the world we've inherited, reality does not have magic. So if you're adding magic to reality, it has to then suddenly become a different genre. But if your view of reality is that there is magic, then it's just realism. It's just literature. You know what I mean? So I was like, it made me second guess, like, why do we call it that? You know? And like, who needs to be informed? Hey, there's some magic in this. Me, I need to be informed, but not everyone would. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it makes me realize how much genre comes out of and is catering to a very particular dominant culture. And you pulled a quote that I feel like really explained the author's like ambivalence about genre.
Yeah, this was a very fruitful interview for me to read. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is a really great interview.
Pen Transmissions, great interview with Lloyd Banwo. This is what the author kind of had to say about genre. She says, you know, I think there's a distinction between how, quote, the algorithm categorizes a book for the market, the academic categorizing of books by common themes or forms, and what the writer actually thinks they are writing. This writer was writing a book that felt true to myself as an African diasporic person with an indigenous sense of religion and spirituality, where time is not linear, where the living and the dead are not as far from each other as perhaps we think. And so what do we call that? What category or form is that? Is it Caribbean Gothic, magical realism, speculative fiction, crime? Well, I suppose it's all of that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you found that interview, because I guess it highlights to me how important practicing taking on a post-colonial lens is for someone like us, to practice looking at genre with new eyes and being like, why do we draw the line there? Mm-hmm. Why do we describe it that way? Like, would other people describe it that way? Is that what other people's lived experience would see? And it's like, no, it's not. So yeah, that's we just found that earlier when we were writing this outline.
As we had the question, like, what does the author think of the genre? Like, if your reality is what other people would call magical, but it's just your reality, then it's just realistic. Anyway, so we've been talking a lot about the vibes of this book, so I feel like it's probably time that we describe these vibes.
Yeah.
I've also, separately, I found in my life, I use the word vibes a lot when I'm being very unspecific. But I just, like, don't know what to say, and I'm like, you know, I had good vibes, ? And it's like, okay, no. In this case, I really do have some specific things I'm thinking about when I say this book has vibes. The book doesn't ground you with like over explaining by like explicitly stating. It's more like suggestions, illusions, descriptions, like feelings, emotions, visuals, less. And this is the intricacies of why this person can see a ghost and all the other people here are not seeing this ghost. You know, it's not like hammered over our heads. Like some of the plot points I was trying to find quotes for in this book, and I realized I'd have to read a long section to get you like the general, like just to get the whole section where the plot point is happening. It's not just like one statement and then Yajida understood everything about her mother. You know, like we don't get that. And that's like the point. But we'll start with one of the big themes of death. So we open with young Yajide hearing the story of the Corbeau from Granny Catherine, which is basically the mythology of who they are. Yeah. And we think maybe this is a folk tale, at least for me when I first read it, I'm like, okay, it's a folk tale, or maybe these are some themes we're going to see in the book, or this is like a mythical story, and now we're going to see it kind of live out in these people's lives.
We should explain, Corbeau are carrion birds. They're like vultures. Yeah. They eat the dead. They're birds. Hence the title, When We Were Birds. And it's a bit more literal than you thought.
Yeah. And then, which for a book of how I described as mostly vibes and not specific descriptions, we get these very poignant moments where the author is like tipping her hand, but we don't realize it yet. So like, at the end of this opening section, Granny Catherine says, and so like in all the stories that changed the world over time, everyone forget that the ending of the storm happened at the same time the Corbeau born. Everyone, of course, except the Corbeau. She bent close to whisper in Yejide's ear, we remember. And you're like, okay, cute story, Grandma. But it's like, no, she's like, this is us. This is our origin story. I just told you all the background you need to know. You just didn't realize these birds were people. Who were maybe also birds? Question mark.
I feel like a great example of the writing style that is most concrete, maybe for a lot of people, is there is technically like a sex scene, but it's so metaphorical that you have no idea what's like physically happening in space. You know, it's all like images of nature and birds and then how she's like feeling and kind of what it means for her and like a bigger picture. And I feel like that's maybe a concrete example that people would really understand. When you read a really metaphorical love scene versus a very like brass tacks but love scene, you know?
Yeah, like this scene ends with this, to give you a sense of what we're talking about. The moths flutter and multiply in her throat, and their wings beat against her eyes, and she roll him over and grip his hips with her thighs. Her hands brace on his chest, his hands on her hips, and they lift off the raft, float past the ceiling and past the roofline, past the forest below them and into the endless sky. And black wings sprout from her back, and her throat grows small and tight and voiceless. Her fingers talon into his flesh, and she drop a single feather as they fly. Don't even see as it scorched the earth below. Like, it's like a different style of sex scene than we get in a lot of other books.
Yeah. Like, is she literally turning into a bird? There were literal moths when her mother died.
Yeah.
There are literal birds that maybe are the spirits of her dead matriarch. Like, is it, you know, we have those small grounding points of small bits of grounding in physical reality, but then it's mostly, is it real, is it not? Who cares? You know, it's, what does it mean? How does it feel?
Yeah, and I think the sense of like, what does this mean to the character is such a driving element of this book. Like we talked about, both Darwin and Yejide have strong family, religion, spirituality, like tradition, and it's not
a lot of rules and doctrines.
It's not explaining like the orthodoxy of their lived experience, but we do get a sense of why it's important. Like, why it's important to the character.
Yeah, and the death as, like, a theme and as, like, a presence in the book. I mean, it's seeped into everything. The whole book is about death. And, like you said, it's not about necessarily the physical realities of death so much as, again, what these deaths... What the kind of spiritual and physical spaces of right? We're in spaces of death We're in like a home that's surrounded by spirits, and we're in a literal cemetery, right? We're in the spaces of death rather than like moments or physical sensations. And so this is what we mean by vibey, again, because it's like you feel surrounded by it rather than experiencing explicit, detailed plot points of it. And it's mostly about, again, what death means to each of these characters. And what death means to each of them, very, very different. You know, for Darwin, it's a job and like a complicated conflict with his mother. For Yejide, it's how she connects to her family. It's her whole family lore and legacy and kind of the air she's swimming in. Part of what initially made me want to look at this book from a post-colonial lens, even more than the language, was the way that you felt like the deeper you got into the book, the more you were kind of swimming in the legacy of death. There's death everywhere. You feel it more than you are explicitly told. There's a few moments where you're told, you know, we get a few statements from like how Yejide's mother talks to her when she's passing on the family lore. It's very like, what the hell's going on? Like, what's happening? I don't understand. Yejide's learning a lot of the details of this stuff for the first time, and her mother gives her almost nothing.
Yeah, for me, it was like the way that the legacy of colonialism kind of infuses throughout the whole novel without the author, except in some moments, explicitly stating or describing things. Otherwise, it's suggested, alluded, and it's just kind of present.
Yeah.
It's similar to how, kind of mirrors the way Yejide and Petronella interact, and even in some ways how Darwin and his mother interact, where things are not said. Things are not, it's just the soup they live in. And like you were saying, Petronella doesn't prepare Yejide for a future. And it's a lot of that tension of like what's going on. And Darwin's mother isn't really giving him much as far as details about his father. It's all like secondhand hearing, like overhearing conversations. And so like the legacy of colonialism is like underpinning the entire novel, but we don't open up the beginning with like a description of what historically happened at Montgomery. So like one alternative version of this novel might have been that story of the plantation, the slave owners, the mysterious fire that destroyed all the slave owners in their house, and the family that survived. You know, we could have like jumped back in history and gotten that. Instead, we open with a mythologized version of this story, the story that is passed down through the matrilineage. And even though it comes out later, it was like Yejide knows the story. You know, that's maybe a reason why it's not a description, because we're focusing more on the tension of what she doesn't know. And so not until she kind of clues Darwin in on her family history and the history of the place she's lived in, does the reader get that experience as well. Instead, we were living in this space of death, of unknown, and not sure what's happening yet. And then we start piecing all the puzzle pieces together. And then we do get moments where we get this like reveal of the theme where it kind of pokes out even more in the writing of this theme of colonialism and like the decolonization process. This is even something that Yejide is just thinking about. It's not even spoken. Here's a little excerpt. Yejide don't have the heart to tell him that it's not only headstones that make a place a burial ground. Under the greens, under fancy restaurants that used to be plantation houses, under the government buildings, under the housing complexes, under the shopping malls, is layers and layers of dead. Unknown, unnamed, unclaimed. It don't have a single place on this whole island that don't house the dead. And that's maybe the most direct we get, besides the historical account of what happened at Montgomery, of naming the legacy of slavery and colonialism in this place.
Yeah, that moment is interesting because Yejide doesn't share it with Darwin, because Darwin's mother constantly refers to Port Angeles as the dead city. Like, you can't go there because it's all death, because that's where Darwin's mother describes it as like, oh, it consumed your father and it'll take you too, kind of thing. And here we get this moment sort of pulled away where Yejide, who can literally feel all of the death around her, is like, it's everywhere. This is the ground we walk on is swimming in death. That actually the sort of job that she has been given to do is to like resolve the trauma and tension of the dead in the aftermath of colonial slavery. That like the first Corbeau, they just called her Mammal, mother. Basically, the story was the house that they're currently living in, they've been living in this whole time. A man and a woman ran away and were caught. A few days later, this mysterious figure appears and then disappears and flies away, basically. And overnight, this carrion bird eats the bodies of these murdered slaves and then burns down the plantation house. And then all together, they rebuild the house and continue to build it as generations go by, as they need more space. And so Mamal's role that she passes on through this matrilineal heritage is the freeing people from colonial oppression and from that tension and from that trauma through a peaceful death, through dignity in death, through care. And that is what Yejide has inherited. But it's so rarely touched on directly. Like, we get that story much later on in the book, and we get her contemplating this in this moment, how everything, the whole city is a house for the dead. But you have to make the connection yourself. You know what I mean? You have to make the connection of like, oh, this legacy is about more than just her mother and her grandmother. This is about a massive global history that is sort of embedded in their lives. It feels big. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where it's like, it's so big that you don't notice you're standing in it because it's just everywhere. And we get these few moments where we get to kind of zoom out.
Speaking of the matrilineal line, I know it's something that interested both of us, and specifically it's the firstborn daughter. The women are the ones that inherit the death and pain, and they're charged with like healing the world that they inherit. So it's like this bigger like spiritual purpose or vocation, if you will. And I find it particularly fascinating that the women don't come into their full power and take on like that full mantle of responsibility until their own mother has died. I mean, part of it is like, let the child grow up so they can be a full human and not be like carrying the weight of the whole spiritual world as like a 4-year-old. But also in a way, perhaps that these women can't completely understand grief and the dead until they've experienced that deep, deep grief of losing your mother. And yeah, it's kind of a lot for them to take on. Yeah, there's a lot of beautiful scenes of this kind of like passing down like women to women, this heritage.
And her mother doesn't like it.
Yeah.
I think that's, we alluded to that earlier, but like part of what's very interesting about these grandmother, mother, daughter kind of relationship that we get is like her mother, Petronella, is she's bitter that she has a daughter who's going to sort of continue this line and this duty. And she doesn't really explain shit. Like, she just kind of complains. Like, we don't get a ton of resolution there. And so Yejide has to kind of figure things out for herself through the little bits and pieces that she's gotten. She really contemplates running. Like, her mother tells her, take your man and run. Like, don't take this on, because it sucks.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I feel like the fact that her mother hates it gives it a lot of weight. But Yejide ultimately does decide to take the responsibility on. And there's this gorgeous scene where on All Saints, all the ghosts of all the women appear to Yejide, and they have this ceremony and she sings for them, and she helps her mother sort of become fully realized as her Corbeau self. But the spirit of her grandmother tells Yejide, is you who giving her life now. The smell of blue smoke, sweet tobacco float past Yejide's nostrils, and she feel the baby powder presence of Granny Catherine standing behind her. Just like how every daughter exists in her mother womb long before she is even a thought, is the daughter who make the mother an ancestor when she die. Her deciding to take on this mantle fully realizes her mother's journey becoming one of these Corbeau. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous scene that's very fraught emotionally, and it's where we start to understand how real the bird thing is. Like, it's not just a metaphor, you know what I mean? And it's where you're starting to understand maybe what Yejide's responsibilities are, because we haven't gotten a lot of details. It's just kind of like, again, vibes. And it's also interesting that where Yejide feels that connection to her ancestors and to the dead is through her womb. It's like through her lower abdomen, specifically through the body of a woman, that this spirituality gets passed on. As metaphorical and vibey as this book is, right, it's sort of saying that the groundedness and the body and the physicality of a woman is what is going to help heal the spirits of their dead, which is pretty cool. It's not something you see a lot.
Yeah, and I think also it's a way to pull back into our colonial lens a bit, kind of undoing colonial patriarchy and like reshaping what does it look to have family, to have kinship, and how do those structures operate? And maybe the author's kind of positing a way to or I guess you could read this in a way that a way to cope with the legacy of colonialism is to like turn it upside down. And so we see this a lot with like the way that men are portrayed in this book, specifically, I mean, the men of Moore and Marie. And I don't know, I think originally they were not my favorite. By the end, they were all my favorite characters.
Yes.
Were the emotional support boys.
That's what we call them, the emotional support boys.
And it's like,
they're great.
It's so great. So like Darwin, steps into, in a way, his own inheritance or his legacy to be one of these emotional support boys. They don't have a name in the book, so that's what we call them. And there's this really great scene at the end where Darwin and the other emotional support boys will name him Mr. Homer, who was Granny Catherine's lover, and Peter, who was Petronella's lover. And part of the like kind of spiritual connection that each of these men have with their women is the women who come into their full spiritual power can see these, like, it's described in vibes, but what we can understand as they can see the exact moment any living person they look at is going to die. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard to cope with seeing kind of the shadow of death cling to every single person in your life. However, their spiritual power there's one person in their life, this like soulmate man, that they don't see that. For Yejide, she describes it as he's green. Darwin just looks like green life to her. Like she doesn't see a shadow of death on him. And so that's kind of how these men have these love at first sight, kind of soul connection moments.
Because the matrilineal heritage gets passed down when the woman before dies, these men all outlive. Like, Mr. Homer was Granny Catherine's, this are 2 generations back, her lover. He's still around. And so they are actually the ones who sort of manage the rituals, because they're the ones who remember how things were done the last time. It's really Peter, her kind of stepfather in a way, who walks her through the whole thing and really grounds her. It's a really fascinating kind of reversal of expectations of what we normally see. It's really beautiful also the way that these men seem to really relish their sense of purpose for these women that they're bound to particularly, but for this family as a whole, because they all stick around after, like, they have no legal ties. They're not often the fathers of the women. They seem to really love it. It gives them a very strong sense of purpose and meaning. And when Darwin meets them for the first time, the way it describes, says, he never meet men like this before. Calm and settled, no knife edge when they reasoning with each other. And he fall into step with them like he know them all his life. Like he just feels so comfortable and safe. And the conversation that they have towards the end of the book, I mean, you mentioned it too, is one of the best scenes. It's one of the few scenes that's like completely grounded in reality, and it's just like a normal conversation. There's very little metaphor. It's just like some dudes sitting around talking about how their girlfriends can talk to the dead. It's like it's very practical. It's very calm and safe and lovely.
Yeah, there was some really great moments that kind of like summarize like what these, or like get at what these relationships are like. I think one of my favorites is towards the end. Yejide kind of has this thought. Maybe that is the deal. She, her mother, all her mothers before that give up everything in service of the dead, but they get something back, an anchor. Somebody rooted and kind and alive to tether them to here so they don't forget that a spirit was a body once. kind of this idea that like these men are in their lives to care for their bodies, to care for their like reality, and like kind of remind them that there's like a reason to stay here and to come back from these. Again, it's not really described, but like these, when they go off and they're like in the spiritual realm or whatever, it gives them a grounding. There's a lot of making tea for each other, which I find delightful.
Yes.
Just like caring for each other by making tea.
Yeah, they manage like the rituals, you know, like the capital R rituals, but then also like the rituals of care.
So kind of moving us towards a wrap up to our discussion here, we could kind of summarize in a bit that by the end, Yejide is caring for souls in the way that Darwin cares for bodies. Not only in the sense that Darwin is a gravedigger and he's handling the bodies of the dead, he also, we get a sense that he has this very caring personality, and he's like learned how to talk with people who are grieving to kind of help them move through that experience, but also like usher them out of the graveyard at the end of the night when he needs to lock up. But also in the sense that Darwin is like charged with caring for Yejide's physical body because she's often too involved or distracted by the spiritual world to fully care for herself. It reminded me of like a very loosely related conversation we've had about like we sometimes esteem these like musicians or composers or like authors, especially like men, as like these geniuses, but we don't always recognize like the emotional and physical labor of the women in their lives to like keep them propped up, to keep them fed when they're having like a moment of genius and like haven't eaten in 5 days. And in the same way that Yejide is like super invested in her vocation of what she needs to do to care for the dead, and therefore she has this anchor that brings her back to reality, but also cares for her body and makes sure that she's doing okay. But I think another element of Darwin we haven't really talked about too much is the care that he has for his father's legacy at the end. So there's a lot of like unknowns, like Darwin doesn't really remember his father. He only hears in snippets and like about how his father like left them. And there's a lot of like tension and unresolved issues there. But Darwin ends up meeting basically like the spirit of his father in the graveyard, and they have kind of like a bit of a resolution. You know, Darwin doesn't hear all the things, but he basically finds out that his father died really soon after going to the city to find work. It made me think about how like dying without acknowledgement, like there was no paperwork, there was no family funeral, there was not even a sliver of a news story mention of a man who died. I make the assumption, it may not be the case, that Errol, the sweeper, the graveyard like manager guy who was like really corrupt, perhaps Levi, Darwin's father, died at Errol's hands. I don't know. But it meant that Levi's legacy was warped, and Darwin's mother, Janaea, and him live with all these questions, and in some cases kind of like assume the worst, that like Levi left them. And so at the end, we get this kind of piece of resolution where Darwin creates a headstone for his father, kind of gets to like recognize the legacy, and then leaves a letter to maybe rewrite that legacy in her mind to give her that closure of like, yeah, he passed really soon after he left us. And he writes, "He never leaves us, Ma, and I never leave you." And I'm like, tears. That little letter at the end was so good.
It leaves you with a lot of feels.
Yeah.
A lot of feels. Because that's kind of the epilogue. It's like we don't get a lot of explanation of what their life is going to look like in the future. We can kind of gather. We get little snippets of like they're going to build a life for themselves in this house and in these roles. But it's really an emotional epilogue where we sort of get resolution of these questions and the possibility of healing in this relationship with his mother and his relationship with himself. And I feel like the two of them stepping into these roles as like together they offer complete care for the dead in all aspects. The living who are left behind, the bodies of the dead, the spirits of the dead, the legacy of the dead. Like it's all kind of the two of them together kind of take care of everything. And the way that power is reversed in terms of gender, you know, the woman is basically the head of the home, right? They are each given this sense of purpose in terms of healing. I feel like the ending is not very prescriptive, you know? Like it doesn't say this is how you fix colonialism or like this is how you heal trauma or whatever. It's very, very open-ended, but it gives you some hints, some ideas. Maybe we need to try something new. Right? Maybe we need to flip our power structures upside down. Maybe we need to become fully acquainted with death and all aspects of it, and mix life and death back together again in a way that, kind of Northern European colonial powers were very much like life and death are very separate. This is something we've talked a lot about. Like, you can extract a lot from the vibes and the feelings of this book in terms of, here are some ideas of how to start to decolonize your sense of family, your sense of your relationship with death, your relationship with gender, right? Like, there's all these big ideas in there, but there's no like prescriptive, like, this is what you should do. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's just like a feeling of, here's something different that feels, even though the entire book is about death, it should be so sad and dark. And it kind of is, but it feels so hopeful.
Mm-hmm. The ending is really hopeful.
Yeah.
The only thing I wish about the ending is that we don't really get more from Seema. And we haven't really talked about her at all in this episode.
I kind of left her out of the summary.
Yeah. So Seema and...
There's a whole queer reading of this novel that's very different.
There's like an intense relationship that Yejide kind of like doesn't... She like takes for granted. And they kind of have a little like fight. Not a little fight. A big fight about it towards the end. Mm-hmm. But we don't get like, does Seema stay at the house? Does she find her own lover? Do they have a polyamorous relationship? Doesn't seem like it. Do things stay tense with her and Yejide? Like,
yeah.
Otherwise, I think the ending is really satisfying and it's very hopeful. And I think Seema's an important character. And there's like an interesting like echo of Petronella and her twin sister, who we didn't talk about either, Geraldine's relationship there. But yeah, there's a lot of like unresolved stuff around that character that I wish we got a little bit more of. But
I agree. That's kind of the biggest loose end. I feel like that's the biggest sense of loss that you're left with. Is like part of what Yejide loses when she takes on this role is like whatever her relationship with Seema is. Because now Seema, all we get of Seema is that like she and her mother have sort of dedicated their lives to taking care of this matrilineal line. Mm-hmm. And that in some ways Seema's like her, like a caregiver in a way, a servant, I don't know, like of like a religious figure, like a priestess of a god, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's kind of that vibe a little bit to it. That feels like the biggest thing that Yejide loses, because that, like, Seema was her constant companion growing up. Mm-hmm. And they were inseparable and kind of like a sister, but more than a sister. She doesn't know how to define it. And there's maybe something she doesn't want to think about in that relationship. We had a whole discussion on, like, is the relationship sexual? I don't know.
I know. We read it again and I was like, oh, after that, like, super metaphorical sex scene we get later in the book, I don't know anymore.
I don't know. I don't think it is in that moment, but like,
it alludes to there's more. Yeah.
There's something. Yejide loses the chance to kind of have a normal life and normal relationships. You know, it's not a perfect ending, and then we have to have something that we've lost.
Okay, for those who enjoyed this book, what would you recommend they read next?
I feel like this is purely based on, like, my experience reading the book. This book feels like if Marilynne Robinson's writing and Toni Morrison's writing had a baby. This is just what I get. So I would say go read Housekeeping and the Gilead Trilogy by Marilynne Robinson, and then go read Song of Solomon and Beloved by Toni Morrison. And to refer back to the Frantz Fanon text called Black Skin, White Masks, it's a really remarkable piece that doesn't feel academic at all, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of big words, you know. It's not super accessible, but it is very beautiful, even in translation. If you can read French, maybe read it in French.
This book made me think of The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina by Zoraida Cordova. And if you've read that book and you're like, Victoria, that's nothing like this book, I would agree. They're not, it just made me think of it with some of the themes. Maybe if you liked this book, but you want to read something a little more fast-paced, if you want to read something even a little lighter, I would recommend The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina. There's a lot of themes of lineage and family secrets and a matriarch, the dealing with grief and like magical realism elements. But there's a lot more humor, and it's written in a very different style. It was a delightful read. Okay, wrapping up our episode, what are the things that are bringing you joy? What are you currently obsessed with these days?
Amine has a collab album called K-Tramine. It's literally just a combination of his name and the other guy, and I don't remember the other his name. It's a good summer rap album. And then this show is not even currently airing anymore, but I'm still so emotionally invested and obsessed with it, and I didn't mention it in earlier episodes. But K-pop reality show where like 100 boys compete to sort of be in a K-pop group called Boys Planet. And normally I don't recommend reality TV, especially not survival shows, but this particular show should be studied in like a queer media class. Like, it is so... People have described, like, there's so many sort of joke summaries about how it's, like, about following your dreams and the power of friendship and being gay. Like, it's so... They bring in so many of these sort of Korean queer icons, and, like, there's an incredible love story at the heart of it that they didn't even plan. That's just like, oh my god. I'm so invested. And then... if you want to, like, scream about it with somebody, the Boys Love Boys Planet podcast, it's two husbands screaming about this show the way that I did just now. And so you can sort of follow along the show with them, and it's a lot of fun. So, yeah, it's stupid how much I care about this show. I follow all of them on Instagram, and they're all friends, and they're just living their little gay lives, and it's great. I'm very happy for them.
Okay, my currently obsessed.
Anyway. Very long tangent, but yes.
Yeah.
Go.
Okay, so I went thrifting with some friends recently, and we went to Village Discount, which if you're in Chicago, there's a few locations. It's the best. It's one of those thrift stores where it's like, nothing's going to cost much, but it will cost your time and energy to find it.
Yes.
It's not curated by any means. It's basically organized by how long are the sleeves and what color is it. So if you have an idea of how long you want your sleeves to be, then you know where to look. But like, even then, I was like, it was a lot. But okay, I'm showing Julia because we're on Zoom. I got this really fun.
Oh, that's so cute.
Sports bra for less than $3. Wow. And I looked it up later. It's a Buff Bunny, which I've never heard of this brand, but it fits so nice. The perfect length. I was so excited. But it had a little stain on the front. And I was like, you know what? This seems like the quality of sports bra that the person who bought it could just throw it away when I had a minor stain. And so I was like, I will gamble my $3 on whether or not I can get the stain out. Because it was like a gross stain. It looked like some sort of orange or red food. Like, not like it has a little bleach spot. Like, it'll be fine. It's like, I'm not going to wear this. Like, I'm grossed out by wearing it if the stain doesn't come out. A little bit of OxyClean, one cycle through the washer, and it's brand new. That's
so exciting.
I'm a huge fan.
I love when that happens.
I know. In other news, I have recently gotten into the Dear Hank and John podcast. It is now my favorite background. I, of course, started it in the most random way. I was like, I don't know much about Kurt Vonnegut. I just searched Kurt Vonnegut, and they had an episode called Kurt Vonnegut Special, and I was like, great, John Green's going to tell me all about Kurt Vonnegut. They're both from Indianapolis. This will be great. No, the show is absolute nonsense. It's so funny, and it was just John inserting quotes from Kurt Vonnegut like every 10 minutes. Being like, as the great Kurt Vonnegut said, and then just would read a random quote. And I'm like, I didn't learn anything about Kurt Vonnegut, but I do have a new favorite podcast. Okay, my new segment I want to introduce is Victoria's Summer Lemonade Corner. It doesn't have a great name yet. Julia, maybe we can workshop some names later. But I want to talk about the lemonade I'm drinking recently and what I think about it. So, the other day, I really wanted a lemonade to celebrate accomplishing a minor task that I've been putting off for weeks. And so, after a nice little jog around my neighborhood, I stopped at the corner market that is apparently too bougie to sell lemonade. I was like, oh, this is one of those stores where you get like $5 bottles of whatever to drink. And I was like, cool, I'll like shell out. It's a little celebration. I asked them, do you have lemonade? They're like, no. And I'm like, what peasant are you that you drink sugared lemon water? They were like, we have a yuzu soda. And I'm like, no. And then they also had an Italian sparkling lemonade that, as much as I want to gripe about them not having lemonade, was actually so good. I'm going to talk about it in my lemonade corner. Galvanina, it's like an Italian sparkling lemon company, but it had like actual pulp sitting at the bottom, so it's like, it's not like a flavor of lemon. It's got like actual lemon
It's like
content.
literally lemon.
Yeah, but it was like carbonated. Thank you for joining Victoria Summer Lemonade Corner. Find us next week where maybe I will have drinking different lemonade, or maybe I'll have nothing new to say because I've just been drinking my straight up lemon juice water.
Da 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 da. Bye guys.
Bye. Happy reading.
Thank you for listening to Book Club with Julia and Victoria. We would love to hear your thoughts on this book or the topic we discussed, so you can share your review and recommendations with us on Instagram at BookClubWithJV, on our website, bookclubwithjv.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also visit our website for show notes with links to all of the recommendations and the things bringing us joy. If you don't already, go ahead and follow us on whichever podcast platform you are listening on so that you can be notified when our next episode is released. This episode was co-hosted and produced by myself, Victoria Bruick, along with Julia Clausen. Rebecca Gasme provides us with project management support. Our music is composed by Greg Bruick, and our logo was designed by Gabby Fabland. Until next time, happy reading.